If I look a little bit exhausted and haggard today, it's for a good reason. Shockingly, the cat distribution system chose me. Say hello to Mila, my new baby, my little feral baby. As you can probably imagine, trying to get a brand new cat spayed, vaccinated, chipped, all that good stuff, it's been taking a lot of my time. So if this video is a little less comprehensive than usual, that's why. But nevertheless, no shenanigans will stop me from sharing with you and my child a tale that I've wanted to talk about for years, that being the story of the Chevalier D'EON. Don't chew on that. An 18th century noble, military leader, spy, and trans history icon. More than likely, if you've heard of D'EON, it's in the context of their transness and maybe even the massive media circus and gossip surrounding it. Is D'EON really a man disguised as a woman, or a woman disguised as a man? The French public demanded to know, and the release of certain biological information after D'EON's death actually only served to make matters even more confusing. It's a whirlwind tale that challenges the boundaries of 18th century gender rules, as well as our own. So what on earth was the deal with the Chevalier D'EON? Who really were they behind all the mad press and politics? This video will deal largely with the narratives and modern issues surrounding D'EON's gender, and as such I'll need to deal with some rather antiquated but historically relevant gendered constructs and terms. So that said, come learn with me. But first, let's hear a word from today's sponsor, Wayfair. As many of you already know, I'm currently hosting Season 2 of the wonderful series A Style is Born, brought to you by Wayfair. Wayfair actually has their own channel on YouTube where they have various shows talking about some fascinating histories of object and design. A Style is Born is a show where we explore the history behind some of the most iconic design styles. You may be familiar with Season 1, which was hosted by Ariel Bissett, who did a fantastic job and explored some super fascinating styles like mid-century modern, cottagecore, and boho. In this series, we peel back the layers of some of your favorite styles and see what fascinating history is hiding underneath, what influences evolved them, what their main elements are, and the social factors that you may not have realized were connected to them, as well as how they're being revived throughout recent decades through to today, so you can incorporate them into your own home if you so desire. You can go ahead and check out the first 3 episodes of Season 2, where we explore Art Deco and Art Nouveau, 2 of my very favorite styles, and then Brutalism, one of the most controversial styles in history. And now episode 4 is out, and we're covering Gothic, one of history's most interesting and enduring styles, just in time for spooky season. So come learn with me by following A Style is Born over on Wayfair's YouTube channel, which is linked in the description below. And now, let's get back to the video. Born on October 5th, 1728, happy belated birthday, although it is their birthday when I'm filming this, Chevalier Charles Genevieve Louis Auguste André Timothée D'EON de Beaumont hailed from Tonnerre, France. According to their autobiography, they claimed that their father was in a great deal of debt, and the only way out of it was to have a son. You wanna go look at the window again? Is that it? When D'EON was born a girl, their parents decided to keep this fact a secret and raise them as a boy. This is not exactly accurate. The truth is, D'EON was born a boy and therefore raised as a boy. The genderining would come much later in their 40s. They were sent to study at the College Mazarin in Paris, where they studied law and acquired a lifelong love of books. They graduated in 1749 and went on to become a well-known man of letters, as they were called, a great writer and essayist. Through their high-end connections, they secured a position basically getting paid to read books, which is like the goal. All things considered, their early life wasn't at all out of the ordinary for any average 18th century French gentleman. They eventually became a diplomat serving King Louis XV at a time when the king was putting together a cute little spy ring called Le Secret du Roi, or the King's Secret. And the secret was basically installed to secure the political power of the Prince de Conti, who Louis was gunning for to be the ruler of Poland. Very messy business. And the Chevalier D'EON ended up becoming one of the secret's spies. So when D'EON was operating as a spy in Britain, they were spending kind of a wild amount of money. because in their logic, they needed to be leading a lavish lifestyle in order to effectively keep up their role and do spying well enough. But France was still getting on their case about it, which pissed d'Eon off so much that they published this big expose basically talking shit about all of these French political figures. They didn't expose any of the secrets about, well, the secret, of course, but it was still wild enough to piss everybody off, and suddenly everyone was out to get d'Eon. The king was put in a tricky place. If he stripped d'Eon of their titles, he could force them into the hands of the British with a literal handwritten royal document exposing the secret, as well as France's secret plans to invade England. But he also couldn't just do nothing to d'Eon because that would undermine the crown's power. So it was at last decided that d'Eon would be given a generous pension and told to stay in London and chill out for a while. And d'Eon suggested a catch. They would return to France as a woman. A truly bizarre and unheard of solution, but a solution nonetheless. After all, this was apparently not d'Eon's first foray into womanhood. According to their writings, they had posed as a young woman when spying for the secret in Russia, although it's more than likely that this Russian cross-dressing adventure that they write about never actually happened, and was actually one of d'Eon's fictitious tales, of which there are many. In order to give you a better idea of what exactly was going on with d'Eon and the spying, let's hear from a fellow history lover, Joel Cook, from PBS Rogue History.
The Chevalier d'Eon's spy work in Russia has been a hot-button topic for over 2 centuries, with biographers questioning the truthfulness of d'Eon's claim that they infiltrated the Russian court by posing as a lady-in-waiting. In 1804, Boston Weekly Magazine broached the topic, telling the story essentially as d'Eon had told it, and following up with an article from a French subscriber who claimed that they knew d'Eon personally. An obituary written in the Gentleman's Magazine in 1810 only mentioned it briefly, stating that the mission was of a diplomatic nature to the court of Russia. But in 1856, Louis de Lomenet published Beaumarchais et son temps, which challenged not just the Russia trip, but many aspects of d'Eon's work for the French monarchy. This began a pattern of alternating narratives over the next 4 decades, with Frédéric Gaillardet's memoir sur le Chevalier d'Eon supporting the claim in 1866, Louis de Broglier's Le Secret du Roi denying it in 1876, J. Bouchon-Telfer's The Strange Career of Chevalier d'Eon de Beaumont supporting it again in 1885, and Ernest Alfred Vistelli's The True Story of the Chevalier d'Eon denying the act, but not the idea, in 1895. A key factor in all of these biographies was the lack of agency that they gave the Chevalier themselves. Only Telfer actually read Chevalier's autobiography, and Gaillardet blatantly lied, claiming that d'Eon dressed as a woman to get close to and seduce other women. It wasn't until 1995, with Gary Cate's work, Monsieur d'Eon as a Woman, that an autobiographer gave d'Eon actual agency. But his work and other modern writings still deny the idea that d'Eon went undercover as a woman in Russia. What sticks out to me in all of these documents, new and old, is a real lack of faith in Chevalier d'Eon to tell their own story. It's always good for historians to ask questions, but we also have to consider what cultural and social influences are framing the questions that we're asking.
Rogue History has their own episode up now about the Chevalier d'Eon, which I've linked below, so definitely go check that out to get another angle to this fascinating story. You may even see a familiar face there. Me. It's me. I'm in a section. What did happen in Russia, though, was a large number of masquerade balls in the court where women were required to dress as men and men were required to dress as women. It's highly likely that d'Eon did attend at least one of these balls and would have experienced, likely for the first time, the experience of not only being regarded as a woman, but regarded as themselves as a woman, which would prove to be foreshadowing to d'Eon's fate. Now, people had started questioning d'Eon's true sex since like 1770, but were refused any real answer. There was even a rumor that they were pregnant. The gossip actually started threatening their safety, and everywhere they went in England, crowds would gather to stare at them because people were convinced that they were really a woman in disguise. There was even a whole court case about it, and people were betting money on the subject. subject. Some historians have theorized based on some evidence that it was actually d'Eon themselves who started the rumors. They literally confessed the claim to Jean de Rey, secretary to the Comte de Broglie. This was possibly partially motivated by politics, as d'Eon was in a pretty bad place both financially and politically, and needed to find a way out without being disgraced or punished, and being hailed as a heroine who had successfully served her country but, oops, is a woman and therefore unable to continue being a spy would do rather nicely, but, it also doesn't make sense. Plenty of European noblemen ended up in exile or in political strife, and never once considered becoming women, especially in this time period. You don't see becoming the weaker sex as a way out unless it's also a way out of your gender struggles, you know? And besides, d'Eon didn't need to become a woman to be freed from being a spy, because when King Louis XV died and Louis XVI took over, he promptly dissolved the secret. Then, suddenly, in 1776, King Louis XVI announced to the world that d'Eon was in fact truly a woman who until then had been disguised as a man in order to serve her country. Louis and his court by this point actually firmly believed this, and d'Eon made no attempt to say otherwise. In fact, they had actually demanded that the French government officially recognize their womanhood with a royal decree. This agreement would come to be called the Transaction. d'Eon returned to the French government their safe containing the secret papers that they held, and a contract was signed cementing d'Eon's new identity. It said, Demoiselle Charles Genevieve Louise d'Auguste André Timothée d'Eon, mature maiden, known until today under the name of Chevalier D'Eon, I demand in His Majesty's name that the disguise which has until today hidden the person of a maiden under the appearance of the Chevalier D'Eon be entirely abandoned, and without wishing to blame Charles Genevieve Louise Auguste André Timothée d'Eon de Beaumont for the disguise of his condition and sex, of which his parents alone are guilty, and even rendering justice to the modest, wise, and sincere, though vigorous and manly manner in which she has always conducted herself in her adopted garb, I require absolutely that the uncertainty about her sex, which until today has been an inexhaustible subject of indecent bets and salacious jokes, which might be renewed, especially in France, and which her proud nature would not tolerate, and which would lead to new quarrels that might perhaps only serve as a pretext for renewing old ones, I repeat, in the name of the king, that I absolutely demand that the ghost of the Chevalier D'Eon vanish entirely, and that a public and unequivocal declaration be made of the true sex of Charles Genevieve Louise Auguste André Timothée d'Eon de Beaumont before her arrival in France, and her resumption of her women's clothes settles the public's ideas once and for all on the matter. Brevity. The 18th century never understands brevity. D'Eon really hoped that the king would appoint them as a female military officer, but that dream was not to be realized, unfortunately. So when d'Eon returned to France the next year, it was in their new life as a woman, which would last until their death. Realizing d'Eon wasn't going to give up easily, they were sent to live at Versailles and be schooled in feminine manners. They were also provided funds to get a fancy noblewoman's new wardrobe. Despite being officially and legally reborn as a woman, d'Eon fought to be able to wear their masculine clothes, especially their dragoon officer's uniform, which they wore to events. This caused a great deal of contention. Now that d'Eon was a woman, their behavior and dress was a massive issue. It got to the point where the king wrote a declaration demanding that d'Eon take up dress appropriate for females, which people believed would certainly make their behavior softer and more modest. Of course, d'Eon protested this, citing their years of dedicated service to the crown and bravery in war, but once the transition began, d'Eon did begin to feel like this was sort of a rebirth. They later wrote, speaking in the third person, such a change completely transformed her mind, her heart, her conduct, her manners, her habits, and her inclinations. It forced her to come alive, move forward, and act as an entirely new creature, resuscitated to all the decency, wisdom, and dignity of her sex. You may be wondering why I'm using they-them pronouns for d'Eon instead of she-her pronouns, given the situation. We'll get into that because the situation is in fact more complicated than it seems. But still, they firmly believed that due to their military service, they reserved the right to still wear men's clothes. They weren't exactly stoked about donning women's garb, nor very comfortable. After all, they had lived 49 years in menswear. After being fully dressed by famous designer Rose Bertin for the first time, they ran to their room and cried for hours. Something to note about the core of this pain that they were feeling: in this time period, if you were promoted to dragoon officer, it was a huge honor and a lifelong commitment. You were expected to wear your uniform wherever you were in public. So to have their uniform stripped from them was like tearing away a huge part of d'Eon's identity. And by fully taking on women's clothes, d'Eon therefore rescinded any hope of serving their country in the future. They also disliked wearing women's clothes in general, as well as the narrow social restrictions that came with being a woman. In one letter, they described themselves as a prisoner of war, and in another letter, they described their situation as being forced to take on womanhood, hence why it's a little complicated. It would take years for d'Eon to settle into their new role and feel completely at ease. Needless to say, the public went absolutely out of control. Pamphlets, newspapers, letters, journals, and more all debated and argued over what the truth really was. Was d'Eon, and therefore the government, telling a huge ridiculous lie? Or were they telling an equally ridiculous truth? Many who had known d'Eon for years didn't believe it, but d'Eon's own mother firmly supported the idea of her child having been born a woman and raised as a boy who must now return to womanhood. Various prints circulated across France depicting d'Eon as an Amazonian goddess or a caricature. Numerous poets wrote poems and songs on the subject. In order to reinforce their story, d'Eon began spreading around various fake stories about their childhood and started writing an autobiography, which was never officially published. The autobiography is only moderately useful today though, knowing what the real truth was. They wrote it assuming that the reader would be of their own time and believing that d'Eon was born a woman that had been masquerading as a man. Thus, the story is flipped and much of the details are entirely fictitious. This wasn't really just a result of the royal decree. d'Eon really and truly wanted people to believe that they were a woman, and on a spiritual and internal level, they really and truly felt that they wanted to be a woman. But what kind of woman they wanted to be was a much more difficult issue to overcome. The flavor of womanhood that d'Eon craved was not something that would be won in the 18th century, even less so as a noblewoman. They wanted something more Amazonian. While spying in Russia, they had told the Chevalier Douglas, "I would prefer to keep my male clothes because they open all the doors to fortune, glory, and courage. Dresses close all those doors for me. Dresses only give me room to cry about the misery and servitude of women, and you know that I am crazy about liberty. On the one hand, my goal is to succeed in a diplomatic career so that I can help my mother and sister by paying off debts that my father incurred before his death. But on the other hand, my love for studying, my desire to finish books that I've started, and many other projects push me to take dresses for working, living, and sleeping peacefully. Here are the two passions of my heart. The one moves me to the right, the other to the left. I do not know how to escape from this Cretan labyrinth." But in the end, d'Eon ended up overcoming the emotional hurdle of the clothes and began to really contemplate on the spiritual meaning of gender. A couple major factors influenced their feelings on gender and led them to unique conclusions. The first being that they had an unusually strong interest in the era's feminist literature. We have records of every book that d'Eon had in their massive library, and out of the recorded libraries of the era, theirs had the highest percentage of feminist books. Still not a whole lot of them, but compared to other massive libraries, there were a lot. They were deeply interested in womanhood and the concept of it and what it means, and had strong opinions on women being allowed to be strong and proactive, and being just as smart and capable as men. And a major icon for d'Eon was Joan of Arc. They not only idolized Joan of Arc, they sought to embody her principles and spirit. Before their official transition in the 1770s, d'Eon spent over a decade eagerly collecting and reading these feminist books, poring over them and noting their thoughts. this wasn't happening in a vacuum, really. These books were part of a broadening European thought movement in the 18th century, where increasingly people were beginning to question gender roles and the very frameworks of sex and gender altogether. Until fairly recently at this point, the sexual construct had operated on largely ancient and/or medieval medical ideas, where it was thought to be indeed possible for people to change sex given the right environmental stressors. The 18th century was a time of massive flux on both a medical and social level, and so, naturally, the concept of transness made frequent appearances in fiction. As a result, it wasn't a random occurrence for d'Eon to be theorizing about gender. It was a natural symptom of a bigger picture. When people have complex feelings about gender and feel at odds with the social constructs that they were born in, it's much easier to imagine ways to actually act out on or outwardly interpret those feelings when more people in your sphere are discussing it, as opposed to if you'd never heard of it being questioned at all. That's why TERFs and other transphobes are so adamant about silencing trans people. They think that if no one talks about complex gender issues, then those feelings will never happen, which, as we all know, that's dumb as fuck, so. But trans-leaning literature has been around, well, forever. These things have always been here, and that struggle continued to carry d'Eon into their other complex theorizing when it came to their religion. But this is where it gets kind of whack. So, d'Eon became a very, very dedicated fundamentalist Christian around 1785-ish, and therefore their musings on gender entered the mix. They came to believe that women are inherently more holy, and that men are less so for a number of reasons, and therefore are like Jews. Yeah, so the Chevalier D'Eon was like really fucking anti-Semitic, which frankly isn't surprising at all to me, because if you threw a rock in any given direction in Europe at any given time in history, there's like a 9 out of 10 chance that that rock is gonna hit an anti-Semite. D'Eon was simply convinced that Jewish people are inherently damned and that the Jews celebrate the human body and therefore give too much importance to the mortal body. Basically, d'Eon was super offended by the idea of the body and soul being equally important or something. Obviously, none of this is worth arguing with because it's just so stupid, but I just want to point out that at pretty much no point in history have Jewish people ever actually agreed about, like, anything, which I think is pretty cool. Love to think about things. So being like, well, the Jews believe about weird, random, specific stuff is just plain indication that you don't know half of a thing about Judaism, but I digress. Anyway, d'Eon firmly believed that in the kingdom of God there is no sex, no gender, no marriage, and no sexuality, and therefore, in order to enter the kingdom of God, you must understand that God has no reason to care about sexual differences, and therefore, God's grace leads to liberation from gender roles. Furthermore, d'Eon believed that men had seized authority, all positions, all honors, all worldly riches, leaving women only the pain brought by having babies. Therefore, through their emphasis on strength and domination, d'Eon believed that men as a gender were morally deficient and unprepared for the kingdom of God. It gets a lot more complicated than that, but a lot of this was simply d'Eon trying to use their religion to make sense of their feelings about their gender and their experience of transitioning. They understood becoming a woman, in part, as becoming closer to God. d'Eon spent much of their later years teaching swordsmanship and fighting and fencing tournaments. They even dueled the Chevalier de Saint-Georges. Alas, in their final tournament in 1796 in England, they were seriously wounded. They were already rather old and struggling for money, so they spent their final years quietly and suffering quite a lot. The truth came out only when, on May 21st, 1810, d'Eon passed away in their London apartment at 81 years old. They had been living there with an elderly widow, a certain Mrs. Cole, who was the one to find their body. d'Eon had been struggling to live for some time after a particularly bad fall on March 4th, coincidentally my birthday. As people in this era did, Mrs. Cole went about the undressing of the body of the Chevalier D'Eon to prepare them for the funeral proceedings. It was through this that Mrs. Cole discovered that d'Eon was in fact the owner of a penis. Thoroughly shocked, she collected a number of gentlemen and an anatomy expert, and the group inspected and dissected the body. They concluded that D'Eon was indeed anatomically male, with no intersex characteristics whatsoever. Thus, the Chevalier's obituary was printed: "On Tuesday died on the 69th year of his age, the Chevalier D'Eon, memorable as a political character and chargé des affaires in this country from the court of France, but more so on account of the questionable gender to which this extraordinary character naturally appertained. The French physician who attended the Chevalier in his last moments and examined the body on its dissolution now positively declares that it in reality proved to be the body of a male." And thus the madness ensued again, but surprisingly not as much as before. It would take until the Gilded Age for the topic to become interesting in discourse again, when a number of biographers tackled D'Eon's story, and the big question of their identity became a new favorite topic of the newly formed world of sexology. Famous psychologist and sexologist Havelock Ellis, who I have complicated feelings about, had a great time trying to pin the Chevalier down, and in typical Havelock Ellis fashion, his stance was, of course, that D'Eon had a psychosexual illness. But contradictory to his usual takes, Ellis also argued that D'Eon's gender issues weren't related to their sexuality. In fact, we actually have no evidence at all that D'Eon ever had sex with anybody, sharpened by the fact that in that era, in the world of nobility in which D'Eon lived, if anyone was fucking, someone had something to say about it, true or not. And when it comes to D'Eon, there's just nothing. It's hard to say if this was because D'Eon was in some way asexual, or if it was a choice for other reasons, or if there was a relationship that we don't know about. The truth is buried in the couch cushions of history. Anyway, in the end, Ellis chalked D'Eon's condition up to a hormone imbalance, basically. And thus, from that point onwards, D'Eon became the most favorite subject of example of any doctor trying to have opinions about trans people, and as a result, the trans community itself really latched onto them. But as we've seen, D'Eon's feelings about gender were more complex than, well, a hormone imbalance. Mysteries aside, they had a lot of very thorough philosophies surrounding gender, and also, a lot of their situation was indeed derived from political issues. So, what do we today do with that? I feel like it's not difficult to imagine that all this hullabaloo of arguing over D'Eon's true gender has never ceased, and the reason for that is simple. Our constructs of gender are always in flux as society ebbs and flows. As such, our contemporary ideas of what transness is also always in flux. The LGBTQ community is constantly, well, I'd like to say discussing, but more often arguing about these very parameters, what they mean to us, and how they function between our identities, lived experiences, feelings, and society itself. While we shape our identities in response to society, often pushing back against it, so too does society respond to those pushes and evolve. And as society evolves, then our language and understandings of self also evolve. That's why there's so often a generation gap between older and younger queer folks. Older trans people are perfectly comfortable identifying in ways that were solidified in a different social realm than we deal with now, and so they might use words that may seem outdated. Time marches on, but a lot of people feel as though the identity that they fought to be able to live with shouldn't have to change too. And as the trans community has become more visible, naturally the way that we discuss and engage with the concept of gender has shifted too. I see remnants of this phenomenon in my research on D'Eon, even outside of their biography. Gary Cates is one of the most prominent D'Eon biographers, and most of his work that I read was published in the 90s to 2000s. Not too long ago in the grand scheme, but long enough for him to be saying stuff about transness that sounds completely alien to today's understanding. He says, "At first I thought that D'Eon must have been Europe's first transsexual, the victim of a disorder that certain psychiatrists label gender dysphoria. I assumed that today he would have been a prime candidate for sex reassignment surgery. Indeed, since the 20s, communities of transsexuals and transvestites have thought of D'Eon as their patron saint. However, several conversations with a psychiatrist who had worked in a gender identity clinic convinced me that D'Eon was not sick. He did not hate himself, he did not hate his body. He did not think that he was trapped in the the wrong body. But if D'EON was not a transsexual, then, well, what was he? See what I mean? 20 years ago, transness was still seen as a medical condition in which one must hate their body and themselves in order to be trans. But today, most understand this to be different, although you'll still see folks agreeing with this in transmedicalist circles, but they are not worth my time. You don't need to hate yourself or even your body to be trans, and being trans is not a sickness. So of course, that unfortunately renders a huge chunk of Kate's commentary on D'EON either completely incomprehensible or simply not relevant. It may have made sense in 2001, but even then, he was still attempting to apply a modern commentary of gender to a person who lived over 200 years ago. Two can play at that game, Gary. Because if we're doing that and now dealing with 2023's trans rules, then D'EON certainly does count as trans and can still be our patron saint. Although, given the anti-Semitism, I'm not exactly advocating for that. Personally. I swear I say it in literally every video, but once again, I'll reiterate the forever truth about interpreting queer history. And that is that there are two equally valid forms of queer history. The first being queer history that was queer in its own time, in its actual historical context, removed from our own modern ideas, and the second being queer history that, regardless of if it was seen as such back then, reflects modern queerness and therefore mirrors the current queer experience or subtext, and therefore is still queer history. We need both. Both are good. And the thing is, the Chevalier D'EON counts as both. You can argue that they weren't transgender because that construct was created a century after they died, but by very strongly defying 18th century gender constructs and literally transitioning, they were certainly still queer in their own 18th century context. And because their life mirrors modern transness, it is, in my opinion, okay to call them trans. Obviously, a lot of folks may disagree with me, and that's fine. Do you? But that's the philosophy we operate with here on my channel, so. This is no hate on Gary Cates, by the way. I'm curious if his views have changed since he wrote his book. Gary, if you're out there watching this, let me know. Anyway, my point is, yes, complexity does not negate the fact that the Chevalier D'EON is a trans historical figure. We can see a modern experience mirrored in them, and in their own time, they were queer too. On a fundamental level, it is what it is. Whether or not they were a good person is a whole other conversation altogether, and I guess you can have your own opinion on that. Personally, they're not my favorite. I do find them very interesting and a super fascinating topic to discuss, but as a person, I'm not a fan. I don't think we would have gotten along. And that's okay. You don't need to like a historical figure to find them interesting and worthy of study. And a historical figure doesn't need to be a good person to be queer. But anyway, thank you for learning with me about a messy and larger-than-life 18th century trans spy. And I hope you enjoyed meeting my new trash baby. I literally never expected that the cat distribution system would choose me, but here we are. And she's getting spayed in a couple weeks. Mila, your womb is gonna be so barren. So, till next time, wash thy hands, wear thy mask, and what do you have to say to that? Say hello to your pets for me.